This is Mark McNeese, and you're listening to One Thing or Another, interviews and conversations. Welcome to another One Thing or Another podcast. This is your host, Mark, and today I have a return guest and someone who's been part of my life in different ways for many years, although we've never met in person. His name is Dave Hughes. He's the creator of RetireFabulously.com, a retirement lifestyle website that's committed to helping you envision, plan for, and enjoy the best retirement possible. He's also the author of 3 books: Design Your Broad Dream Retirement, Smooth Sailing into Retirement, and The Quest for Retirement Utopia. Now, Dave, I'm looking forward to retiring in about 15 months. So how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, and also thanks for the opportunity to chat again. It's always fun to do one of these podcasts with you. Overall, I'm doing great. As I like to tell people, we have adjusted to the hermit lifestyle because of the pandemic, spending so much time at home and with so little outside contact. Not something that we would choose, obviously, but something that we have adapted to and learned to live with. It's also not lost on me that for many people who don't, make a lot of effort towards, forcing socialization into their life, for a lot of people, retirement ends up like this. And so it's kind of, a wake-up call for that.
Well, we're coming up on a year of this, and because I work in a grocery store, as you know, I have not stopped working in all this time. I work 4 days a week. I worked a lot of extra days last year because of the pandemic. We had so many of the grocery store associates out, either because they had the virus or they were in close contact with someone. So it was quite a year, and to know that it's coming up on a 1-year anniversary since I first started having to wear masks. And I remember thinking at the time, I think it was March of last year, that, this is going to last for a month and the schools are going to be closed for 2 weeks. And it has not turned out that way at all. I am personally looking forward to getting vaccinated, and we're supposed to have it at the Giant pharmacy. I work at the Giant, and they have a pharmacy. A friend of ours just quickly got his first vaccination in Bethany Beach, Delaware, and he went to the Giant. So I'm hoping that in the next month or two that this new administration is going to do a better job of dealing with this pandemic than the previous one.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to imagine doing a worse job.
How are you doing in terms of the vaccine?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, here, Arizona has been neither the best nor the worst state at their vaccine rollout, but we're still at the stage here where you have to either be 75 or above, or, of course, they took care of the medical professionals first, which they should, and now they're in the phase where teachers and other, frontline type workers are able to get their vaccines. And I play in a steel band, and many of my bandmates are school teachers, and so they're talking about, they're getting their first and their second shots and all that stuff. But with me and my husband Jeff both being just under 65, we're not going to fit into a qualified group of people anytime soon. So we're figuring we're probably going to be getting our vaccine in April. I mean, we'll get it the moment we can, but it looks like our turn's not going to come up for another couple months.
Well, I should be in line soon because I work in a grocery store, but it's also hit and miss, and I'm just exhausted by it all. Now, you mentioned being in a band, which was going to be the topic of today's conversation, because we've talked about retiring and the website and your books and all that stuff. But I wanted to just find a different angle, and I know that music is very important to you. So let's talk about that. You mentioned that my mother was a piano teacher. My father owned a music store. I don't know if you knew that. He had a One
Oh,
time
I
he had
didn't.
3 music stores. That's how he made his money. And my mother was a piano teacher and had been a piano player all her life. So I related to you saying that your mother enjoyed music and that she gave you a collection of children's records. And can you talk a little bit about that influence, how that started with you?
Sure. It's one of those things where you don't even realize that it's happening at the time, but then later when you go back and look, you say, oh, this is what planted seeds. And so I've always just really liked music. And part of it is, my mom had a small record collection, mostly classical, and she'd play some of that. But then they got some set of children's records that were made. And, that I don't mean, cartoon songs or whatever. It's more like, a child's introduction to music. They have some with various classical pieces on it and different styles of music. But at any rate, I listened to those all the time. The other thing is the one record we had, because we had gone to see the movie, the original Mary Poppins soundtrack album. And so we had that. I played that to death. I could sing along with all the songs and everything, and so I've always liked music. And in 3rd grade, 2 things happened. One thing, we moved to a new community, and so I suddenly was in a new social situation and had to make a whole new set of friends. But at the same time, my mother forced me to take piano lessons for 2 years. And at the time, I hated it. And in retrospect, it wasn't because I hated the music. I actually really liked that. But number one, I hated being forced to do things. And number 2, at the time, boys playing piano was perceived as sissified.
Mm-hmm.
And here we'd have other boys in the neighborhood out playing ball in the street or, playing however they played. And, I couldn't come along for at least for an hour a day because I had to sit home and practice my piano lessons. And for a boy who was already, I was already a little bit self-conscious about being perceived as masculine enough and all that stuff, to have that thrown in there just made it even worse. And so, anyway, I played piano for 2 years, and, I was reasonably good at it. And in 5th grade, that's when band started in our schools. And Mom said, well, you can either switch to a band instrument or keep taking piano or just quit music altogether. And I decided that I would opt for the band. And I can't even remember why, but I was led to the trombone. And so I started learning to play the trombone. And immediately, the music lessons came in handy because I already knew how to read notes on the staff, how to count rhythms. I already knew the mechanics of music, so all I had to do was learn how to play this weird, sort of piping, slides in and out. Whereas many of the other kids who started in band in the 5th grade had to start from scratch and learning, to learn to read music. So I've played trombone ever since. The pandemic has put a halt to my trombone playing for the time being. But before the pandemic came along, I was in 3 jazz ensembles. And so, being in at least one band has been part of my adult life. For a good bit of it, not 100%, but a good bit.
I wonder, trombone, what drew you to that? I don't think too often of it. I don't know. It's just, when I think of a band instruments, I think like, what would I want to play? What a trumpet, sure. You had like Dizzy Gillespie and all these. I can't even think of where a trombone fits into an ensemble.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the reason for that is because we are a lower voiced instrument, especially in your concert band or orchestra settings. Most of the time, we're playing background parts.
Okay.
which isn't always the most exciting thing. I mean, it's always a reason to celebrate when the trombones get the melody in something. So there was that, but here's the other thing that is the interesting angle to this story. So on my mom's side of the family, I had no living cousins. On my dad's side, there were plenty of cousins and all that kind of stuff, but on my mom's side, there wasn't. Now, she had an older brother who had a son who unfortunately was killed in an auto accident at the age of 19. And that was 5 years before I was born. So I never met this fellow. His name was Donnie. Mother would tell me about him every once in a while, but obviously I never met him because he died before I was born. But Donnie played the trombone, and he was supposedly very good at it. He played in bands, and they got lots of gigs and that sort of thing. And I don't believe I was ever even thinking of that or aware of it when I sort of felt the calling to pick the trombone. But what happened after a year or so, I mean, my parents started by renting me a cheap trombone from the music store. But after a year or so, when it looked like I had some aptitude and some talent for it and that I was going to stick with it, my uncle came for a visit one time. He lived in Pennsylvania. We lived in Ohio. And he brought Donnie's trombone and gave it to me. And so that is the trombone I still play to this day. I mean, it was a pretty good horn. And so, in a way, without even realizing at the time, I'm kind of carrying on the legacy of my cousin who was killed at a young age.
Oh, so that's what you were talking about when you said there was more to the years later. There was more to the story.
Yes,
you mentioned that.
Yeah, and my husband Jeff is a medium, and as it turns out, Donnie occasionally comes here for a visit, and has occasionally been at performances that I've played at. Jeff has sensed his presence there. In fact, one time, Donnie even gave Jeff a message that said, David needs to have his horn repaired. And in fact, it did require a minor repair. So I took it in and got that done. So that was kind of an interesting story there. So maybe I was influenced to pick the trombone and I wasn't even aware of it at the time.
That's possible. Now, I have a question. You mentioned playing the guitar. Or trying to, but you said, let's just say that I was no Terry Kath. Now, I'm sorry, but who is Terry Kath?
He was the guitar player in Chicago.
Okay.
For the first, 10 or 11 of their albums.
Oh, and, Chicago covers. Okay, yeah.
Well, yeah, but for example, 25 or 6 to 4, there's a guitar solo in the middle of that that's pretty famous. I mean, most aspiring guitarists at some point attempt to learn that solo. But there was also, because I was a big fan of Chicago when I was in high school and college, because it was a band with horns. And as a trombone player, naturally, I liked that. Plus, they were all over the radio. And but Terry Kath was their guitar player, and he was extremely well revered. And in fact, early in Chicago's story, they were invited to tour as the opening act with Jimi Hendrix. And Jimi Hendrix even said that Terry Kath is a better guitar player than I am. So that's pretty high praise. But at any rate, all that is to say, so I mentioned that I loved Chicago. And so when I was in high school, I put together a band with the same instrumentation, a trumpet, a sax, a trombone, guitar, piano, bass, and drums, and wrote out a bunch of Chicago tunes and a few others as well. But we attempted to be a Chicago cover band for a while, and we were reasonably good for a bunch of high school kids. I don't think Columbia would ever have offered us a record contract, but we were reasonably good, and it was fun. Hey, Ray, to get back to guitar for a second, because I kind of left that thread hanging. Uh, Also, not long after I quit playing piano and started playing trombone, I also wanted to learn to play the guitar because, for so many, adolescent boys and everything, being a guitar god, is, something they want to do. And so I had that as well. And so I went out. My mother kind of said, okay, we'll pay for the trombone, running the trombone. We'll pay for lessons. If you want to learn another instrument, you can pay for that. And so with my paper route money, I bought a $22 electric guitar and a similarly cheap little amp and paid for my own guitar lessons. And I got, reasonably good at it, but one thing about me is I'm not really a very good practicer. I was not willing to lock myself in a room for 4 hours a day and practice. And that's what it takes to get really good on an instrument. And so I was always kind of a so-so guitar player. And in high school, for my jazz band, they needed a bass player. And so I kind of thought, well, a bass, that's just the bottom 4 strings on a guitar. I can play this. And so the director gave me a bass, and I seemed to have more aptitude for that than for guitar. So to this day, that's like my my secondary instrument. So I played a lot of bass throughout my life as well.
Now, you said that you were introduced to the steel pan in the mid-1980s. What is a steel pan?
Oh, okay, sure. So this is an instrument that was very organically created and developed on the islands of Trinidad and Tobago, probably primarily Trinidad. And steel pans, which people often call them steel drums as well, the terms are sort of interchangeable. Okay. But they, back then, Trinidad was still a British territory, and there was racism and all that. And so a lot of times the native people weren't allowed at the time to have instruments, or much less to, form little bands and carry them in parades and all that. And so what they did is they just took pots and pans and beat on them, for rhythms, both for their own musical edification and so forth. They noticed after a while, being on pans long enough, the bottom starts to get dented in. And they realized that the sound started to change when that happened. So the other thing with Trinidad is that they have oil there, and it was also a shipping stop and all that. So they had tons of old 55-gallon oil barrels laying around. So they would take these and saw off just like one end of it with maybe several inches of the side of the pan, and they would use hammers to beat the lid of the steel pan into a concave bowl, and then they'd also pound little circular areas out of that bowl that they could tune to notes. And so they essentially created the instrument we now know as the steel pan from old discard 55-gallon oil drums that they would hammer into shape in order to make notes when you hit them. And the art has been refined over all these years, and now they're they're just as valid a musical instrument as any other, percussion or wind instrument and so forth. And there's a neat little subculture that has sprung up around steel bands. Some colleges have steel bands in their percussion departments, like Arizona State does. You even find occasional high schools that have purchased sets of steel bands, and for the kids to learn to play on. And then you have groups such as the one I belong to now, which are just adults who love the instrument and are getting together to, form groups and play on them.
Now, you said that horn blowing is on hiatus until the pandemic's over because it spreads viruses, the breathing like that.
You can't play a wind instrument with a mask on.
Oh, that's true too. Yeah. Well, that's funny.
Doesn't work. Yeah. And but it's sort of like I discovered steel band and I discovered steel band music back in the mid '80s, and I've collected some CDs throughout the years, various steel band players, and I've always thought, if I were ever to learn another instrument, I want to learn that one. And then finally in June of 2019, I thought, why keep putting this off for someday? Let's turn someday into today. And so I called this guy that I'd met a couple times that I knew led this steel band. And I said, gee, how do I get started on this instrument? And he said, well, come to our next rehearsal, and I'll let you kind of beat around on the drum a little bit. You can see what you think. So I went to a rehearsal, and they were very nice. They pulled out a couple really easy pieces of music for me to try. And after one evening of sitting in with them, I was hooked. I said, I love this. I want to move forward with this. 2 days later, I plopped down $1,800 for a steel band. And I ended up getting a really nice one that had actually been made by one of the craftsmen down in Trinidad and imported. So I have a genuine Trinidad steel band. And I've been with that ever since. And as it turns out, of course, we had no idea that a pandemic was coming. But when it did, it's like I can still play in this band because we can rehearse out on the band leader's driveway. We can stay spaced 6 feet apart, and we can all wear masks. So that has been one musical outlet that I've been able to continue with during the pandemic.
Now, before the pandemic, you were involved in, I wanted to ask you about Desert City Jazz. You were in 2 jazz ensembles at local community colleges, but you also founded Desert City Jazz, a 17-piece big band for the LGBTQ and ally community. How did you go about founding a 17-piece jazz big band?
That's a good question. So, first of all, I need to take a step back from that. And in Phoenix, as well as many other cities around the country and some others around the world, they've had gay bands since the 80s. And they originally started as people wanted to put together marching bands to participate in pride parades. And so, it wasn't too hard to round up a bunch of people who had played in their marching bands in high school or college and to form gay marching bands to play in their parades. Well, not long after that, these bands said, well, okay, what do we do for the rest of the year when it's not Pride Month and Pride parades? It's like, well, okay, we'll sit down and perform concerts, just like the concert bands you probably had at your high school. And so there have been gay concert bands and marching bands, since the 80s. And I knew that some of the ones in bigger cities like New York and Los Angeles and Chicago had also formed jazz bands sort of as spin-offs from the concert bands. So we moved to Phoenix, and I was disappointed to learn that Phoenix band that they had in the 80s had kind of fallen apart at some point over the years. And finally, in 2010, Jeff and I and a few others refounded that band. So we even gave it the same name that the band had back in the 80s, which was Desert Overture. And so this all started with forming a gay concert band, marching band sort of thing. And then after that picked up steam, within a few years, we regularly had 50 people in the band. And I decided, it would be great to have a jazz band too. And so initially, the instrumentation of a jazz big band is usually 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, 5 saxes, piano, bass, and drums. and sometimes they'll have a guitarist or a percussionist as well. Um, so initially, this new jazz band was formed with people from Desert Overture. Now, not all of them were that interested in jazz. I mean, they were willing to try it for novelty, but what gradually happened is somebody in the band would quit for whatever reason, and then we would go find somebody, because several of us in the band were also involved with other jazz bands in the community that weren't LGBT oriented. So we would go out and ask one of our friends in one of those bands, hey, we've got an opening in the trumpet section. We want to come play in this band. And they'd say, okay, sure. And we'd say, and by the way, just so you know, it's primarily LGBT, but allies are certainly welcome. And inevitably they'd say, oh, I don't care. I just want to play, And so we've gotten to the point now where the band is like 50-50 LGBT people and straight allies, and everybody gets along great. Bridges have been built, and that's one of the reasons we have the band, frankly, is to build bridges between us and the rest of the community. So I guess the short answer to your question, rather than the long one, is this sprung out as a side group from our concert band and then developed into a unit of its own.
Now I'm gonna to wrap up. It seems easy to determine how it's all enhanced your life, because music has been a part of your life for many, many years. Has retirement facilitated your enjoyment of music and your ability to participate in all these things?
Oh, absolutely. Because, number one, trying to battle for the pandemic, I was often in 4 bands at a time. I'm in my steel band and then 3, jazz ensembles. The other 2 of which, by the way, are community college bands. And since I didn't have a work schedule to work around, and I don't have to worry about, nighttime meetings or being on call or any of that sort of stuff that I had to do in my career, it's really opened up my calendar so it's easier to participate in these things. One of my community college bands meets during the day, which I could never do if I was still working. And it's funny, that band consists of 2 major clienteles, the college students, and then a bunch of us old geezers who are retired and want us to play our instruments. And we all sit together among each other, and it's fine, So, yeah, definitely it has freed up the time, to be able to play music a lot more.
Well, Dave, it's nice to have a topic other than retirement, although that's always part of our lives. I can't personally wait. I'm so tired of what I'm doing. I do it for the health insurance, as millions and millions of Americans do. But I certainly can see the light at the end of the tunnel, 15 months away, whatever it was, 13, something like that. And I am going to be really busy too. I can't wait to have the time to do even more creative things. Music, and it's interesting, music was a huge part of my life story, although I don't play an instrument anymore. I played the piano when I was young, and I would compose my own music. But I think having my mother as a teacher worked against me, because I didn't want to study. If I had had a teacher who was not my mother, I think I would have put more dedication into it. But she was my mom, and it's like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to practice. But so music was foundational to my life, even though I am not a musician anymore. I'm a writer now. I write words and stories and books. But it's good to talk to you again. Thank you so much. And I love still reading your articles and sharing them with people, and it's very insightful. I thought you were one of the best retirement advice columnists out there, so keep that up. You going to do that?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Oh, yeah. And, once you retire, are you going to just simply do more writing, or do you have other creative outlets you're thinking of branching into?
Well, really just, oh, good, you can interview me now. I recently I have 10 audiobooks out of my books, my mysteries, my novels, and they've all used narrators that I've hired. My most recent murder mystery, I decided I wanted to do something different, and not because I'm cheap. I'm not cheap. I've always paid the narrators, but I wanted to narrate my own book. But I'm telling you, audiobook narration is very difficult. It's time consuming. I'm hugely impressed by people who do it professionally, because it's not easy, and there's very little money in it. So I said, I just want to record my book, not for fun necessarily, but without all of this other stuff to it. So I'm doing it as a podcast. I'm putting out 3 chapters a week that I read myself, not live. I record them and then I do an introduction. But I'm also recording all of the chapters. In about 2 weeks, I'll be finished with 56 chapters, and I'm going to put that out as a single audiobook on SoundCloud. It's not Audible. You'll be able to just go to the SoundCloud playlist and listen to my book, 56, one chapter at a time. So I'm going to do more of that because I really love doing it. I love working with sound and creating audio files and all of that stuff. So I really see me doing that, at least, for the foreseeable future. And of course, writing all the time. I've got another 4 or 5 books I want to write, and my weekly podcast with Rick. I think that's kind of it, but it's enough because it takes me, I can spend
that's plenty.
I can spend 5 or 6 hours every morning at my computer easily. I get up at 4:30 in the morning with the help of our cat, Wilma, who thinks that that's when she must be fed. But it helps me because it gets me, I need the seclusion. I have to be secluded to write. So I gotta like be alone at my desk before the birds are singing and my husband is walking around and all of this stuff. So that's what I can't wait to do more of. Let's put it that way.
No, that sounds great. It sounds like you have a bunch of dimensions to that rather than simply just sitting and writing. So, I think I sounds like you have a full plate envisioned for yourself, which is wonderful.
I do, and I'm probably going to work part-time, maybe 3 days a week, not more than that, because since we're talking, I started collecting Social Security, and my first check was in December. My birthday was in October, because I don't want to drain my retirement account. So I said, you know what, I'm taking it at 62, and you can make up to $19,000 before they claw anything back. And I don't make a lot more than that. So this year, it's like I said to my boss, I'm not working more than 4 days a week because I have full-time benefits with a 4-day-a-week job, 8 hours a day. And then when I quote retire, I'm still going to go in and work for the extra money, but not in a deli. It's killing me. I'm so tired of it. And that's going to be my future until Frank and I say, let's do something else. Let's move somewhere.
Cool. All right. Well, it has been wonderful to catch up with you, and thank you for inviting me onto your podcast. And I hope I didn't get too long-winded with my answers. I know I can do that sometimes.
Well, thank you, and I'll see you on Facebook. That's for sure.
All right. Okay. Bye.
Bye. This is Mark McNeese, and you've been listening to One Thing or Another, Interviews and Conversations.